Sure will. Stand by 1 minute. Okay, you are streaming and recording.
Great. Welcome, everyone, to today's open meeting of the NSB-NSF Commission on Merit Review. My name is Stephen Willard, Chair of the Commission, and I am accompanied by the Commission's Vice Chair, Wanda Ward. The Commission on Merit Review is comprised of members from the National Science Board and the National Science Foundation. Let's start by taking the roll. Roger Beachy, Anisha Needler,
I'm here.
Steve Leith, Candace Major,
Here.
Matt Malkin,
Here.
Sarah K. McDonald, Julia Phillips,
Here.
Scott Stanley,
Here.
Kayvon Stassen,
Here.
Wanda Ward.
Here.
Thank you. Our NSBO liaisons are Portia Flowers and Bush Miller and Alexandra Serchel. And our consultant is Brad Gutierrez. We are also joined by Albert Einstein Distinguished Educator Fellow Michael Stewart and AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow Andrew Zidell. Welcome to the team, Michael and Andrew. I'm continually impressed by the work of the Commission. We've covered a lot of ground in a short period of time, but I want to especially thank you all for your hard work in August, coming to a consensus on our areas of analysis. Since then, we have secured a contract with Mathematica to spearhead our data collection efforts with a focus on our areas of analysis. Over the next 2 months, they will be developing a data collection work plan, which will include instrument development and pilot testing, stakeholder-specific questions and collection methods, analysis and burden minimization plans, and an OMB clearance package, all of which will be made available for us to review and provide feedback before data collections begin. You will have an opportunity to provide feedback on a draft work plan next month. At our last open commission meeting, we heard from various federal agencies on their respective approaches to proposal review. Today, we turn back to NSF to consider our review criteria, but more specifically, the use of additional review criteria. As we all know, the 2 board-approved review criteria implemented across the agency are 1, intellectual merit, which encompasses the potential to advance knowledge, and 2, broader impacts, which encompasses the potential to benefit society and contribute to the achievement of specific desired societal outcomes. However, as illustrated in the broadening participation portfolio and program solicitation shared in your background materials, it is clear that additional review criteria have been developed and utilized to evaluate proposals for funding to achieve NSF broad mission. During this hour, I'd like us to begin considering the potential for additional criteria. What are the additional criteria and accompanied guidance currently in use? How are additional criteria implemented? Why have additional criteria been developed? Is there a need for board-approved additional criteria to be applied across the agency? Continuing our practice of commission members joining Wanda and me in guiding the conversation, today we will be asking Sarah K. McDonald, Senior Advisor to the Directorate for STEM Education, and National Science Board member Julia Phillips to lead our discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce Alicia Needler, who will provide some background information for today's conversation. Alicia, of course, is a member of this commission, but she is also head of the Office of Integrative Activities and is well positioned to help orient us to the use of additional review criteria across the agency. Materials have been provided in tabs 3.2 to 3.4 of your diligent book. Alicia, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me get everything set up here. Oops, sorry. I have many screens I'm operating off of here. Okay, so do you see my slides? Okay, great. Thank you. So thanks again for this opportunity. And what we wanted to do today was to provide a brief overview and then followed by discussion about the additional solicitation specific review criteria. So I wanted to give kind of a bottom line up front, major takeaways approach here in hopes that these would be some sentiments that the commission members would walk away from. So with the additional solicitation specific review criteria, and this is in addition to intellectual merit broader impacts, these types of criteria have been used for many years throughout NSF across lots and lots of different solicitations. So these are things that provide more information to both reviewers and to the PIs who are constructing the proposals and submitting those proposals. It's a very transparent way in which the programs can tell the community, again, as tell the reviewers what is going to be evaluated within the proposals. They also provide good scaffolding from the intellectual merit and broader impacts. So there's a lot of examples that we're going to go through today that show that connection to intellectual merit and broader impacts. Some programs, the additional review criteria are a little bit more complex than others. So we'll get into that in our examples. But the solicitations and the broad agency announcements are those that may include additional solicitation specific review criteria. It's not a requirement, not all of them have them, but it is the case that dear colleague letters and program descriptions, which are two other ways in which we communicate about funding at NSF, those mechanisms do not utilize additional review criteria. Additional solicitation specific review criteria are often associated with specific requirements in the funding opportunity, such as evaluation or some other kind of aspect that's been included in that particular program. And again, PIs and reviewers receive this information and it provides insight into how these proposals will be evaluated along these areas of maybe specific opportunity. And then all funding opportunities proceed through multiple levels of agency review. And so lots of eyes get put onto these types of criteria. So as an overview, I'll go through some of the, well, I'm going to talk very briefly about policy guidance that we have, and then I'm going to go through several examples. So the policy documents that we have at NSF for the outside community, as well as, again, guiding reviewers and award management and so on, is the Proposal and Award Policy and Procedures Guide, or PAPG or PAPPG, depending on how you want to talk about that acronym. And so in the PAPG, the guidance is additional solicitation specific review criteria are allowed and can be included in solicitations that are put out by NSF. And then in our proposal and award management or manual, proposal and award manual, which is an inside of NSF document, it also provides just a mention of additional review criteria that they are allowed, but it's not extensive. It doesn't say all additional review criteria have to have these particular characteristics. It doesn't give specific guidance that you can include it for this and not for that. It's just that it's allowed. And then programs and divisions and directorates work together to figure out what it is that they want to put forward in the solicitations. So let's see a few things here. So first, I wanted to provide kind of what would someone see in a solicitation that's telling them a general sense of additional review criteria. So for example, there might be guidance like this. All NSF proposals are evaluated through the use of the 2 National Science Board approved merit review criteria, but in some instances, NSF may employ additional criteria as required to highlight the specific objectives of certain programs and activities. This is a pretty common phrase in a lot of solicitations. And then after this kind of paragraph would appear, then some detailed items that are relevant to the additional specific review criteria. So within, and this might be another way in which the criteria are introduced. Within the evaluation criteria stated above, and in this example, meaning intellectual merit, broader impacts, reviewers will assess the following. And then from that paragraph, a bunch of detailed additional review criteria would be provided. Another example of context. For the program, questions such as the following, they're often relevant to evaluating proposals in terms of intellectuals merit in NSF's merit review criteria. And so then again, it will give additional examples. And then this final version here, NSF's 2 standard review criteria are incorporated into the additional research criteria described below. So there's a lot of flexibility in how these additional review criteria can be introduced in the solicitation, but it's the case that there's usually a lot of bullets that follow a paragraph like this. So let's see a few examples. So this is a program called ExcelNet, and many directorates participate in the ExcelNet funding opportunity. So there's going to be the standard intellectual merit, broader impact section that talks about how the proposals will be reviewed. But then in the additional solicitation specific review criteria, this kind of content appears. And I'm not going to read through all of this, but I wanted to highlight just a few things. So again, it says reviewers will be asked to address the following when evaluating proposals. And so for a PI proposing in a writing of their proposal, they need to make sure that they see these review criteria. If they're going to do the design track, then they need to be aware that there's going to be this assessment of strengths and weaknesses around the network of networks. So that's very solicitation specific. Or they're going to need, reviewers will evaluate the feasibility of the plan to recruit and foster diverse and internationally competent workforce. That's very solicitation specific. So that's how most of these kinds of things go. It might be divided up by different types of proposals that can come in to a solicitation. Like in this instance, there's different types of proposals that can be submitted: design track, the implementation track phase 1, or the implementation track phase 2. So it really kind of depends. Again, this is why we call it solicitation specific, that it has different ways of looking. So this is the major research instrumentation program. This is NSF-wide program, so all directorates participate in this program. This helps institutions, large and small, secure equipment for their research. And so you can see here that in addition to intellectual merit, broader impacts, additional evaluation criteria will be included. So for all proposals, they talk about the organization's capabilities and so on. And there are different parts of the proposal that are required, some letters and some other things that need to be included. And this is how reviewers will look upon that material and be able to evaluate it. For instrumentation acquisition proposals, so the MRI allows acquisition versus development proposals. So this is a way in which these different types of requirements will be evaluated in the context of the MRI proposals. I've also included links to each one of these solicitations in case you're interested. So another program that is the ATE program is focuses on community colleges. So this particular program, and I wanted to highlight this because the headings for this are specifically put into the context of intellectual merit and broader impacts. So they've extended out based on the requirements, and this is very much about the technical workforce development, other things that are needed to train individuals in the workforce and so on. So there's some specific criteria that are included there, or the specific ways in which the parts of the proposal will be evaluated. And then in this program, and this is the last of my examples, I do have a few others that they're associated with some programs that were highlighted in preparation for this meeting. I certainly can keep going, but I kind of feel like you're seeing a lot of different examples. This one is very interesting. I feel that for this program, and this comes out of the social, behavioral, and economic sciences, that this program seeks to assess the potential long-term significance of research projects. And we've talked about that in the MRX Commission. So I wanted to highlight this in particular. And so they just have 2 additional areas that they want proposals to address. So the expected longer scope, longer term significant, and reviewers are going to give scores for this particular assessment. And then also, as described in the proposal, what's the likelihood that the project will be conducted successfully? And then reviewers are asked to give a score. So then it says proposals generally will be competitive if both ratings assessing potential significance and likelihood of success are high. So you can see that we have a variety of options here. Different programs have done very different things that really help to highlight and reinforce areas of the solicitations. So with that, I'll stop unless we need more examples. I look forward to the discussion.
Is there a discussion? Anyone have a comment? Just speak right up.
I'm glad that we saw that Alicia showed us that, because that looked very good to me, a lot of those. So I didn't realize we're already doing a lot of good things that this commission has been discussing. We just need to figure out a way to do it more, maybe more systematically. But that was just my initial reaction.
Thank you, Alicia. You've certainly given us some things to think about.
Okay,
At
great.
this time, I'd like to turn to Julia Phillips to start us on what I anticipate will be a robust conversation.
Well, I certainly hope so. Thanks very much, Steve. So the examples that Alicia shared, as well as a different set of examples that was in our diligent book, really provide a nice feeling for the spectrum of additional criteria that are included in the evaluation of proposals in different parts of NSF. And I think there are a couple of things that I hope we can get at during my part of the conversation. One is, how broadly or narrowly they should be applied program by program or across the agency. The other is sort of the differentiation between additional criteria or emphasized criteria that actually fall within the 2 main criteria of intellectual merit and broader impact. And so I think the first question that I would put out there is, and some of Alicia's examples kind of started to get at this, is of the examples we've seen, are there examples of additional criteria that do not fit in some way, shape, or form within the rubric of merit review and intellectual merit, intellectual merit and broader impact? Well, maybe I'll talk just a little bit longer. The examples that were in the diligent book, there was the long-term research in environmental biology that asked for a decadal research plan as well as the existence of core data, since it is a long-term longitudinal kind of study. So that's one example. Another one is the ATI, Advanced Technology and Instrumentation Program, which talks about asks proposers to address the impact of the technical development that's proposed, as well as the impact on the community and connections to industry. The biodiversity, I think that one is an international collaboration, and so Alicia talked about things around that. And finally, the research, the RIE in TIP, actually says incorporates merit review criteria into the quote additional criteria. And so, first of all, do these things fit within the usual merit review criteria, and could they be covered by emphasizing aspects in the two criteria that are agency-wide, or do they really need standalone criteria?
Julia, I'm just going to jump in here to make sure that I'm understanding correctly.
Please.
I think you're sort of asking us to think about crosswalking and mapping additional criteria to intellectual merit and broader impact. And that language that I believe Alicia had on one of her slides that was saying, in some instances, NSF would employ additional criteria as required to highlight specific objectives. And so is it a question about highlighting underneath the buckets of intellectual merit and broader impact? Got it. Okay, thank you.
That's the question, because we're really trying to get at whether those two criteria with appropriate emphasis for a given program are sufficient, or does there need to be something else in at least some cases?
Thanks, Julia.
Surely somebody must have an opinion about this.
Well, I have my hand. I mean, I don't have an opinion other than to just say, I think that's a very well posed question, Julie. I think that would be really helpful to understand. Yeah, you know, when there are solicitation specific criteria, to what extent are they tantamount to elaborations or kind of more specific guidance within intellectual merit and broader impacts, versus to what extent are they essentially new sort of third or fourth entirely new buckets of criteria?
Right.
I think that's an important question. I just wanted to echo that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. I mean, as I started digging into it, that is something that really started occurring to me, and I think it's for those of us that don't live this every day, that I think that's one of the reasons why sometimes we get a little tangled up between broader impact and, for example, broadening participation, which clearly fits within the overall goal of broader impact, but is not the only thing in there.
So if I look at the elements that are part of broader impacts and intellectual merit, and those are, you know, they talk about the potential for new knowledge and benefit to society, but also whether these are creative, original, and potentially transformative topics. Are they well reasoned and well organized, blah, blah, blah. The one area that I feel like all NSF proposals could use some, but again, I can think of a few examples where this might not be appropriate, is having a proposal talk about sustainability. Either sustainability of the project ideas, the resources that get invested in as part of the project, the mentoring and maybe even capacity for the institution to continue to do this type of work, or for the investigator to continue to grow and scale their research. Something that has to do with, this is not a one-off investment. What is it that this particular project could do to help sustain a research program, a pathway that this research is on? But I would suggest that that's an element to the two criteria, not a new criterion or anything that way. We could easily add it as an element.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I as you were giving your examples about building capacity and things like that, the broader impact was particularly coming to mind in terms of how that might very naturally fit in there. So maybe some rewarding is needed, or I mean, maybe I'm missing something there that really is different than broader impact. And I mean, broader impact is really sort of beyond the work that is actually being provided here, or that is being proposed, which to me implies a longer term, but you might want to be more specific about that. So from the board side, any other thoughts? Oh, yes. Okay. Sarah Kay and then Wanda.
Sorry, I'm not on the board side, but I would say that, you know,
That,
just
that's fine.
okay, just elaborating a little bit on what Alicia had said. I mean, if we think about the additional review criteria as a mechanism to really clearly convey detail where it, in a particular context, it seems
Mhm.
helpful to elaborate, right? So under the
Right.
heading of intellectual merit, this is something that is of particular interest. It's sort of a transparency issue in saying this is particularly important. To go back to your original question, I think it would be an empirical matter of reviewing solicitations and doing a survey of all of the solicitation specific criteria to make a judgment, if the commission were interested in doing that,
Mhm.
of the extent to which things clearly nest under or might suggest, you know, an additional element that could be used that would obviate the need for additional criteria. But
Yeah.
don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, no, it is helpful. I think my question would be whether, if it fits under intellectual merit as an example, whether it really is an additional criterion or an emphasized criterion or a required criterion.
Mhm.
So, I mean, that's a semantic thing, but no, really understanding better whether all of these things that are now called additional criteria really could fit under one of those two buckets. Could be a useful thing to do. Wanda.
Thank you, Julia. Two thoughts come to mind. I was struck by the slide, Alicia's slide on the context for additional review criteria and how different parts of the foundation use the standing of IM and BI. In the first, it says within the evaluation criteria stated above, reviewers will assess X, Y, and Z. So this clearly places the two criteria as the overarching consideration. The second one says, for the program, questions such as the following are often relevant to evaluating proposals in terms of NSF merit review. So there's a relevancy as opposed to the overarching status of those. The third is particularly interesting to me because it says NSF's two standard review criteria are incorporated in the additional research criteria described below. So it's kind of all over. This slide is very useful in demonstrating the variability of the approved to review criteria. We might want to give some thought to how this informs the commission's review. Second question that I have for consideration is that we often talk about, and the criteria always state different dimensions within the review criteria that are of interest. And I believe we've been told a number of times, broadening participation and workforce development tend to rise to the top. But there are several others, economic development, we know all of the others. I'm wondering whether we should take a look within those dimensions of whether additional criteria are used or not.
That's okay. Both excellent points. The one you cited about including the merit review criteria within the additional criteria semantically strikes me as odd, but that is in the engines material. And so that's a very recent one, and one that is, of course, of extreme current interest. So I just throw that out there for context. But no, those are really excellent points. And I think one of the other things that struck me was how diverse these emphasized criteria are. I mean, it is everything from workforce and economic development and things that we often think about as falling in broader impact, to the things that have to do with the viability of longitudinal studies and things like that. So there is a really broad set of criteria that get pulled out in these, quote, additional criteria. So thank you for those thoughts, Wanda, and you bring up some excellent points that we should be considering probably in more depth as we go forward. Kayvon.
Yeah, I'll put this question or thought out now, but if it's best held for later in the conversation, please say so. So one thing I'm wondering about, again, sort of looking at those examples of solicitation specific criteria that Alicia shared, and obviously there are many others. Do we know, I guess this is a question for the NSF staff or program directors, do we know whether there tend to be certain solicitation specific criteria that kind of come up over and over again? I mean, I'm sure there are some solicitation specific criteria that really are like very, very surgically specific to that one solicitation, but I wonder, are there ones that are kind of, you know, of a kind that might be natural ones to consider as sort of elevating to agency level just because they come up over and over and over again?
So I'm going to speculate in a couple of places and then utilize some conversations that I've had inside of NSF. So it would be great if we had all the bandwidth in the world to create a whole inventory of all of these examples, and then we could go in and use a smart search engine and find the thing we need, take it off the shelf and plug it in, but we don't have that. However, people do look at solicitations and they borrow from each other and they have conversations about what has worked well. And especially I think in the context of evaluation, when a program requires some kind of evaluation, whether it's STEM education evaluation or some other programmatic evaluation, that there is definitely borrowing from one solicitation to another when people are doing that. I also spoke with an individual in OD to talk a little bit about how the approval process works and so on. And so his awareness across all solicitations that come his way, he notices patterns and so on. But there's also, again, that flexibility to really fit the needs of the program and to guide the reviewers plus the proposal writers in the best way possible.
One question I would have connected to that, Alicia, is are there is there any directorate division or division that has sort of a boilerplate or something close to boilerplate additional criteria that show up in pretty much every solicitation that goes out there?
So I'd only be speculating. I'm sure that there's someone like that happens somewhere. But I would say that that's probably not necessarily the norm.
Okay, great. All right. I mean, one of the things and one of the potential questions was whether additional criteria should be implemented at the agency level. Certainly based on the examples that you showed, Alicia, as well as what was provided in the Diligent book, it appears to me that they are so diverse in what they ask for that that thinking about putting something at the agency level doesn't make a lot of sense. Am I missing something there?
While others think, I'm not sure. I agree with you on the face of it, Julia, because there, by design, there's so much diversity and variability across the divisions and directorates. I was struck by Alicia's point and wanted to ask, in some of our planning meetings, we've just sort of brainstormed to consider the value of OIA developing a bank of additional inventory. When you were talking about of additional criteria, when you were talking, Alicia, about the feasibility of inventorying, I'm wondering, under our buckets of implementation and accountability, might there be a feasible and affordable way, in fact, to invest in something like that, given the importance of these additional criteria in the decision making about awards that are made? What are your thoughts on that?
I hope my
I think that.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
No.
No, go ahead.
I think to the extent that this becomes or is determined by the commission to be an important area, a suggestion in that regard with a lot of flexibility around how NSF would do something like that would, I can see the value. However, I think it's really a matter of priority. And this is one of those things that, a good search engine, some machine learning, some ways of extracting information, but that may not be as affordable as it sounds or isn't quite yet at that affordable level. So I think there's a lot to this. There are a lot of solicitations. We have over 700 funding opportunities at NSF. Not all of them are solicitations. Some are dear colleague letters, some are program descriptions and so on, but there's a lot of information here.
I really think it's intriguing. Then I'm finished. Sarah Kay, I'm sorry, Julia, you'll continue. I really do think planning towards the future and given the capability of all that NSF funds in the communities, having state-of-the-art capability might be worth the investment over the long term in terms of the benefit and the information that it can provide us in an evidence-based form. So I would encourage us as the commission to keep this idea as a possibility. Thank you, Julia. I'm finished.
Sure. No problem. Okay, I'm going to call on Sarah Kay. That will be the last comment on this part of the conversation. Then I have a couple of concluding comments. So Sarah Kay.
Oh, I'm glad you have some concluding comments then, Julia, because I don't think I deserve the last word on this, but just, sort of building on what Alicia and Awanda and indeed you, Julia, were saying, it seems to me, going back to this idea of crosswalking and mapping, it could be a lovely, juicy empirical project to collect, not just in a current year, but over a period of years, solicitation specific criteria, and to see, to Kayvon's point, if there are particular themes that are more or less frequently addressed. But I think back to that point of providing flexibility to sort of operationalize and be clear in communicating to the community in a particular context what the 5 elements with respect to intellectual merit mean, how they should be interpreted, the specificity with which they should be addressed. I think there's probably a balance there between identifying common themes and thinking about particular ways in which those are best conveyed to given communities. So, but there's a part of me as a researcher that would love the task if it were the appropriate priority, given all the other things that the commission has talked about doing, to really dig into that. And so I think that's part of the balancing what's juicy and would be nice to know with what we really need to know to inform recommendations moving forward. So.
Okay, great. This has been a great first part of the conversation. The 2 things that I take away are, one, at least a majority, if not all, of the additional criteria that we've talked about today arguably fit within intellectual merit and broader impact. That suggests a couple of things. One is we probably need to look at the language around those 2 things and make sure it is as sharp and clear as it needs to be. The second is that I think the term additional criteria is just not right because they actually almost all fit within those 2. And so emphasize criteria, some kind of change in the language, I think is really necessary there. And certainly allowing solicitations to emphasize aspects of those. And if there really is something that doesn't fit, well, then that's fine. That could be fine too. But really cleaning up the language and making sure our thinking is very clear on this as we go forward. Those are kind of the two takeaways that I have from this part of the conversation. And now it is my great pleasure to turn the floor over to Sarah Kay to lead the rest of the conversation this morning.
Thank you so much, Julia. So, we've heard and talked a bit about the rationale for employing additional or solicitation specific criteria, right, to highlight specific objectives of certain programs and activities. And we've heard a bit and talked a little bit about their application. So I'm wondering, against that background, and also thinking about prior discussion in the commission of the current merit review elements and principles, I wonder if colleagues have any initial questions about or thoughts that are related to policies and guidance. So let me offer an example in the interest of kickstarting conversation, but please don't let that curtail conversation. Please feel free to weigh in with any thoughts on the policies and guidance topic. So as an example, in her presentation, Alicia noted the flexibility with which solicitation-specific criteria can be introduced. Does the commission have any questions about or concerns with that flexibility? Might agency-wide policy or guidance to shape a program's use or application of these criteria be helpful? So again, that's a big area, and it may not be where your mind was initially taking you, but let me go back to the original prompt. Any questions about policy or guidance in this space? Julia.
Yeah, I mean, certainly one of my questions would be, you know, is there guidance, a policy and guidance that exists now? And you know, sort of who has the final say in terms of what hits the street?
So in terms of the review process of the solicitations before they're issued? Sorry, Alicia,
Yes,
you sat
exactly.
forward. I didn't know if you
Yeah.
wanted to comment on that.
Well, I was going to say that, you know, as I said before, the two policy document or sets of documents that we have tell us that it's allowed, but doesn't necessarily provide us wording guidance or anything that way. But the, you know, programs get approved by divisions, which then get approved by directorates, and then it goes to the policy office, and then it goes to the office of the director. So there's a lot of different parts of the process and a lot of different people who get to say what things look like.
And so maybe going back to my initial prompt, again, it doesn't need to be something that you want to weigh in on, but you know, that balance between flexibility and guidance, and what kind of guidance, if any, additional guidance does the commission think might be helpful to programs as they are developing these criteria? Or maybe things are
Well,
just as they are.
Yeah. Yeah, it just, if I could blurt in, I think clarification of, you know, what really fits within the existing criteria and should be emphasized, as opposed to something that is qualitatively different from what falls within those two buckets. I think some clear thinking and, you know, probably some guidance is in order there.
Thanks, Julia. So I know there are several members of the commission who haven't yet had a chance to weigh in or haven't felt moved to weigh in on this discussion, but I want to make sure we give everyone an opportunity to raise questions or observations. Anyone else? Yes, Kayvon.
I counted to 10 before raising my hand in case anybody else wanted to.
Thank you.
So let me ask Julia's question maybe a slightly different way. Could it happen now that a specific solicitation introduces additional solicitation specific criteria that would be wholly separate from intellectual merit and broader impacts? Could that even occur? No. Okay. And the reason that you're shaking your head is that there's specific policy that says that may not happen.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, which maybe gets back to Julia's point about the term additional and how that may be more confusing than enlightening. So I know I am personally dreadful at letting the 10 seconds go by. I'm horrible with periods of silence, but I also have an eye on the clock. So maybe stepping back a little bit, you know, we've heard a lot about and I imagine colleagues are still likely digesting today's presentation and the conversation on solicitation-specific review criteria. So appreciating that thoughts on this may still be evolving, right? And bearing in mind all the other areas of analysis that the commission has discussed, and as Steve mentioned, upcoming data collection plans, I'm wondering at this point, is there any additional information on current application of these additional review criteria that colleagues would find useful to inform any commission recommendations in this space? Excuse me. And any thoughts on where this maybe falls with respect to priority of all the issues that the commission has been, expressed an interest in learning more about or in addressing? Julia.
Well, I would guess, and I assume that Alicia and others can either corroborate or educate me, that when there are these additional criteria, emphasized criteria, if a proposal does not meet those criteria, then it is done, independent of how wonderful it might be in other regards. Is that correct?
Sorry, Julia, could you state that one more time? If an additional criterion isn't addressed satisfactorily, how would that be weighed in a larger decision?
Would that be essentially the kiss of death for a proposal if it does not address those additional criteria?
Hmm.
So if we think
Because
about,
if it is, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
if you think about the SBE example I provided at the end there, the Higgs criteria, and it was the scoring ones. It said if you got a high level of on both of those items, it would be more competitive than if you got a lower score on each of those items. So, to me, kiss of death sounds like it just wasn't feasible from the get-go kind of thing. I think that it would be deemed less competitive and potentially likely to be recommended for decline.
And Julia,
Okay.
I hate to put Candace on the spot, although by saying her name, I realize I'm going to. Again, it's been a while since I was a program director, but I'm thinking about the review process, right? So reviewers would advise on whether, they would note, oh, there was a solicitation specific review criterion. In our collective opinion or an individual ad hoc reviewer, in my opinion, this was not addressed or was not satisfactorily addressed. That would be pointed out. But again, those comments are advisory to the program officer and might be weighed with respect to other comments. So they might say, there were 5 solicitation specific criteria. 4 of them were brilliantly addressed. 1 of them really wasn't addressed that well or wasn't addressed at all. Again, I think it's advisory, and that would speak to the program officer's role in deciding whether it would be appropriate to consider recommending something for award or decline. But Candace, I don't know if that fits with current practice, or you would agree.
I think you've articulated it pretty well. In my experience, reviewers will get specific instruction in the case of solicitation specific criteria to address those. And if they are not addressed, or if they're not addressed in the proposal, that will be identified in the review, either ad hoc reviews or panel reviews. The program directors who run the panels are very careful to step through any solicitation specific criteria and have comments on each of those things. And as Sarah Kay said, if those are not addressed or are weakly addressed, that will be a weakness in the proposal and make it less likely to be competitive in a competition.
Thank you. Kayvon.
Thank you. So picking right up on that, I am trying to remember when I have been a reviewer on a panel for a program or solicitation that had solicitation specific criteria. I'm quite sure that I remember that in many cases, if not all cases, review panelists were instructed by the program directors to explicitly address the additional criteria in the reviews. Okay. Mm-hmm. Here's what I don't remember is when a panelist formally puts their review into the system, what I don't remember is, are the review comments directed at the additional criteria? Do they still go into either the intellectual merit box or the broader impact box? There's not another box, right, that says this is the review comments pertaining to the other stuff.
You know, Kayvon, you ask a great question, and I knew before today's meeting that I needed to see if I could look at the interactive panel system to see how that's laid out. I'm going to say in my memory, but my memory is old. It's been a long time since I reviewed, that there had been a particular box in which those comments could be placed. I would need to go back and check whether that's still the case. Again, don't know if somebody else, Candace, if you might recall, but we could check that for you for sure.
I don't think there's total consistency in how that's done everywhere. I think it's fair to say that just as in Alicia's slides showing different wording and different wording across some of these solicitations. Sometimes it is fit explicitly into intellectual merit and broader impacts as the solicitation specific criteria, and sometimes it's not. I mean, we saw that just in the examples at the beginning.
So I'll just say as a follow-up comment, it sounds like there may be an opportunity to make sure that there is better consistency with regards to when there are solicitation specific criteria, making it very clear that they are not they are not additional high level criteria parallel to IM and BI, because earlier the answer was that may not happen, but to make it clear in the wording and the presentation that that's not what they are. And also even in the review, in the instructions given to reviewers, and maybe even in the review platform, right? You can imagine ways in which the messaging and the signals can get a little bit syncopated.
Thank you. Really, really helpful point. Wanda.
Very briefly, and I throw them out for consideration more than answers at this time. But we would also want to give some consideration to whether the elements and principles that guide our evaluation of IM and BI are also used at the level of additional criteria. Do they take into account these principles and elements? Also, per some of our previous commission conversations, it would be of interest to know how additional criteria factor into the portfolio balance that goes into making an award and shaping a portfolio of awards. Final comment is, I believe bio has a very, I would now consider forward-looking a set of additional considerations. It may be through management plan, I'm not positive, as opposed to an additional criterion per se. But they have asked about, and I believe through a management plan, how a proposal plans to ensure safe and healthy working environments. And given the considerable amount of attention that we're now giving to sexual assault and harassment considerations, if I can ungarble my words, it would be interesting to see how, in addition to additional criteria, how the use of management plans really do help safeguard not only the research and education, but the players, the researchers and educators themselves that propose to conduct the work. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you, Wanda. Alicia.
So I wanted to say a few things kind of in broad principled ways, but one, I'm going to start actually with specific requirements. So, intellectual merit and broader impacts have to be explicitly addressed in proposals in two places, the summary and in the project description. And without that, then the proposal is returned without review. because it's not compliant with our guidelines and the policies that we have for submitting proposals to NSF. So the guidance that we give in the intellectual merit broader impacts and also in these additional review criteria is the guidance for reviewers. This is how reviewers are going to review the proposal. Now, the proposers, they have this knowledge up front, and good proposal development practices suggest that if you know what the criteria are, you should write your proposal to make sure that you address the criteria. So we don't want to hide our criteria from anybody writing a proposal, because then, how do you win if you don't know what you're being evaluated against? But really, in a kind of a principled way, those criteria are available for the reviewers. The reviewers are the ones that are looking at these additional review criteria and trying to evaluate what's written in that proposal. And not all additional review criteria are the same kind of ilk. So some might be, is an evaluation plan in there or not, versus is the evaluation plan quality? So there are different ways in which different programs, as you saw in many examples, do additional review criteria differently. So to Wanda's point earlier about the kind of elements of broader impacts and intellectual merit, that to evaluate, do they have an evaluation plan or not, really doesn't require an element or any other kind of guidance, versus what is the quality and how are you assessing the quality of this evaluation plan and so on. Well, there could be a little bit more guidance. So, this is, again, as it comes to rubrics and ways of doing review, it's a complicated process, but the guidance that we're trying to provide through all of these additional review criteria and broader impacts in intellectual merit and the elements and the principles, this is all helpful for the reviews, for those reviewers who are trying to apply all of that consistently to the reviews that they are in charge of.
Thank you so much, Alicia. And, thanks to everyone. I suspect we could continue this conversation for quite some time. I'm sure that we'll return to it as the commission continues its work and prioritizes the topics on which it wishes to offer recommendations. But for now, with an eye on the clock, I'd like to pass the mic back to Steve.
Thank you so much, Sarah Kay and Julia. And thank you all for a really great conversation. Our next meeting will be October 25th. However, as you know, we are also aware of a possible government shutdown, which, depending on when and how long it lasts, could affect our commission calendar. So please stay tuned. Looking further ahead, I'd like to schedule some time for us to reflect on what we've discussed so far and begin to identify potential preliminary recommendations. Therefore, I ask that you complete the poll sent out by Portia earlier this week, asking for your availability during the week of December 11th. Please respond by Friday so that we may hold this date as soon as possible. For those watching on YouTube live stream, we welcome your general suggestions and inquiries. Please contact us at meritreviewcommission@nsf.gov. And to learn more about activities regarding this reexamination, visit nsf.gov/NSB. Thank you again for a productive meeting. This concludes our business for today, and the meeting is adjourned at 12:59. Thank you.